Right, so welcome Zoe DePero, Unruly Ascetic, to Keen Yoga Instagram. Not Instagram now, it's YouTube chats, in fact.
Yeah.
Off to a good start. So Zoe and I have talked before, and today we're going to talk specifically on the issue of what constitutes a community, an Ashtanga community. So perhaps you're a teacher who's not authorized and feel like you're not part of the community because you haven't been to Mysore and not authorized, or perhaps you're a student who feels that maybe you know people online and you have a sense of reach in terms of interacting with other people's posts, but you don't necessarily feel included in a Ashtanga community. And I don't know whether there's an easy fix, but we're going to try and talk about some ideas of how we can further a sense of support and community in Ashtanga yoga. Because all too often, and I found this myself, I don't know about you, Zoe, it can degenerate into competitiveness, even if we would
hmm
like it not to. And people, I wrote something recently on this, and often people say, "Oh, well, let's not, it's just the intention, and the intention is good, and why we don't have to be competitive." But I think that the precedent that is in Mysore is hard to construe as other than easily leading down the competitive road, right? And my experience was that it
Yeah.
wasn't so supportive as quite competitive, and it made me competitive as well. It wasn't like I was seeing something. Oh, I'm not having any part of that. I was well involved in it, Right. So,
I
yeah,
think,
hold my hand up.
I think it depends on who your social circle, who your like microcosm of community
Mm,
in
mm,
Mysore is.
mm.
I was really fortunate to have a group of friends who, like, we would talk about whether we had a good practice or a bad practice, but I didn't even know what many of their last postures were because we didn't talk about it in that way. So I was really lucky that that didn't exist in my close knit circle. But you're absolutely right. With the way the practice is presented and the progressive aspect of it and the fact that you can see what everyone else is doing, you're very aware of kind of where you fall on
Mm,
the
mm.
spectrum of quote unquote advancement. So there is that. I don't think as much as you can avoid being wrapped up in any competitive aspect of it, whether you're at your home shala or discussing it online or in Mysore proper, like you're gonna have that inherent awareness of what your last pose is and kind of what the perceived level of advancement and required commitment
Mm,
goes along with that pose.
mm, mm.
And that it gets worse and worse, right? Like
I,
at first you're like, I just want to finish primary, and then you're like, I just want to
unfortunately, it
catch
does. Yeah,
Satvasana.
yeah, yeah. And then you get to the early spot because in Mysore there's a very early kind of group who is the perceived the most advanced,
Yeah,
and then everyone
totally, you're
is
right.
very, very. Even if you're not, people start pointing out afterwards what you've done and what
Yeah,
Surat said to you. So
yeah.
I didn't necessarily go there with a kind of vanity towards it, but just inherent ableism that I had,
hmm
attracted that. And it's hard if you don't have any groundwork set to avoid becoming entrenched in that, because
hmm
just because you practice yoga doesn't mean you're anything to do with yoga, being a yogi,
hmm
just someone who happens to be a bit flexible,
Yeah,
and then and then you enjoy it because you're good at it, for God's sakes, and then people give you praise,
yeah.
and,
The
and
positive reinforcement from being
yeah,
good
yeah.
at it.
So
Yeah.
it's a very slippery slope. And what I was going to say though is that not only that, what I feel is the pressure of teachers that come home and they're in inherent competition with each other because many of them,
Mm.
will know each other and be in the same town, and
Oh, sure.
their perceived level of advancement, and their
hmm
right, and all that goes with it, and their position in the community in Mysore kind of
hmm
sets them. And I found this a lot, and maybe I'll. This is a good subject, and I'm interested in talking about this. Is that it sets people, the teachers who should be supporting, at least in their own town, for God's sakes, the Ashtanga community, end up being the kind of arch rivals.
Yeah.
The student that goes to this teacher in the same town,
hmm
then is not welcome to go to this teacher, and it's just
Yeah.
craziness.
Yeah,
Um,
I think something that goes hand in hand with the competition is a sense of exclusivity, and the Ashtanga practice and method has at least a reputation of exclusivity that I think plays into all of that. Like there's the exclusivity of being able to go to Mysore in the first place. So if
mm,
your teacher has been to Mysore, they have this exclusivity of experience, but there's also like who has done these postures, who has been given this permission. And then at a home shala, there's, do you practice at the exclusive shala, or do you practice at the, like, I don't know what to call it, but like the second class shala that doesn't have an authorized teacher, that lets people
The
do
B
poses
school.
that they're not qualified for or whatever. And
Yeah.
so there does seem to be this perception of there's either the diehard exclusives, which I think most people can't help but want to be a part of for good or bad, and then there's the other.
Mm.
And if you don't adhere to all of the rules that qualify you in the exclusive group, then you're just other. And as we've discussed before, there's this ongoing, like, the people who are exclusive, we hold on to our desire to be exclusive, and the only way to maintain exclusivity is to exclude, is to say that other people are outside of our group and don't get to join it, which, like, is counterproductive to yoga.
In the most cynical way, it's also kind of selling, isn't it? As well, I've been to Mysore, I've invested all this money, and therefore when I come home, I'm the only person that's actually qualified to teach this. Right? If you really want to learn it, right? Like, so I mean, it's it's a little bit of a kind of MLA selling, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and like you were talking about the parampara, the idea of that, and this handing down, and this like personal connection to a source, like is the base of that structure of exclusivity that we've created. And like, maybe it doesn't need to be there, but it is, and it impacts how we engage with our home shalas. Like, if there are 2 authorized teachers, then like there's the level 1 authorized versus the level 2 authorized, and like it's such a multi-level marketing scheme of teaching that, like, teachers take on assistants often, like, they're unpaid, or they pay to get to be assistants.
Yeah, so it's a kind of. Oh, really? You've heard that before?
I mean, that's what we do in Mysore. We're paying to work.
Okay, right, okay, yeah. There's a trickle down, isn't there? Because as you say, then they've got their people who teach like them and who do what they say, right? And then it's just craziness. I don't know.
But then where do they go? Where do those people go? When they
but then they go. Well, what happens is they go off, start their own places, and fall out with the teacher that's taught them.
Yeah,
so it gets worse. But whilst you're in that group as well as a student, what I notice is that there's also this. It doesn't often feel that supportive because you've got a kind of a coterie around the teacher, right? Their assistants and the favoured ones, right?
Yeah.
And then all the other people, right? So it doesn't always feel most supportive, and yet this is taken to be traditional, right? That you've kind of got this, as you say, the word exclusivity, I suppose, is akin to this idea of traditional, that you've kind of excluded so many other possibilities to keep it a certain way. And everyone wants to be traditional as well. Everyone wants to do it as it was, I mean, even though this tradition, quote unquote, is only 50 years old.
The people who the tradition has favored want to maintain the tradition. But the people
and those are able to do it.
Right. The people who are able to go to
Mysore,
the people who are able to make the shapes with their body, the people who are able to maintain the lifestyle necessary, and are willing to make the kind of interpersonal sacrifices necessary for the shapes, they are desperate to maintain that tradition because they've invested their entire lives into it. So I understand that. Like, I completely understand if you have invested 20 years of your life and any number of avoided, pizzas and bowls of ice cream or whatever, so that you can do these effortless TikToks, and you've paid thousands of dollars to have this experience with your teacher and to have your teacher's blessing to teach, and you go home, like, I understand why you would want to maintain that tradition.
Yeah,
It's
there's
just that
someone down the road goes, oh, with the B in the B Shala. Well, you don't need to do any of that. You can still do
right.
Ashtanga yoga. You can eat your ice cream. You don't have to go to Mysore. You can do,
Yeah.
like you just think, well, fuck you. I mean, I've just
Yeah.
invested, and
Right.
not eaten ice cream for 20 years to do that. So, yeah.
Right. And I think what's really difficult is one doesn't have to be wrong for the other to be right. Like this way of approaching the practice and structuring your life around the practice is fine. And if that serves you and you are happy and you are serviceable and you are kind, then amen. Great. I'm so glad that worked for you. But that structure doesn't necessarily work for everybody. In fact, it doesn't actually work for that many people in regular life. So being a stickler for that tradition when you're teaching students who it doesn't really apply to is not useful, and I think ends up coming across as combative, if that makes sense.
Or legislative, like kind of obviously controlling it, basically. It's kind of
Yeah.
like controlling someone else's experience of their own body, which is really a kind of bugbear of mine, right? And especially this idea of the gatekeeper postures, which I hate
Mm.
the term, and that seems to be the mainstay of passing down the tradition of Ashtanga in the traditional way, right? That you know, you start and stop people. You can do this
Mm-hmm.
posture, and that's a lot of the teaching is structured or simply around stopping people.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Not enabling people. I mean, which is a
Mm-hmm.
shame. And that's why I started the podcast that I did in the first place, because all the early teachers had this experience of being, albeit perhaps too encouraged by Batabi Joyce, but encouraged, right? Like, do another one. Try this. That kind of freedom of structure that was originally
Mm-hmm.
there became increasingly increasingly kind of critical, or
Well, and
um,
we touched on this last time. I think it has a lot to do with how Mysore and Sharat Shala, how it works. That structure is necessary for safety and to keep
yeah,
everyone safe and to keep everyone, consistent in their labors. And it's a very slow process that way. Um, and it's funny because on one side you could say that holding people at postures is manipulative, is controlling, that you should let people explore and you should let them, kind of confront their ego in their own time. But on the flip side of that coin, stopping people very consistently and making them wait for a long time, in some ways is safer because they don't do as much. They're not likely to hurt their bodies. But it's so personal because where one person is going to learn patience and learn to just, see value in what they're doing, see value in where they are, a different student is going to push themselves way too hard because they're desperate to get past that point. So, one size does not fit all.
I think it's I think it's good to it's requested in the Mysore tradition to promote the one size does fit all, because then there's an objective truth rather than coming back and going, well, this thing which is Ashtanga, which is really quite loose.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like one person is kind of good, they can
Well,
do more, they're a bit older, so let's leave. I mean, imagine, and I've had this experience many times, you've got people in the Charlotte, you've got a 50-year-old guy in a city stockbroker who I was working in the city of London, right? He can't do lotus, in fact, he can't really sit cross-legged, right? Like, what are you going to do, right? You're just going to try and give him the primary series as the ones that he can do, right?
yeah.
And
Well,
then someone
and
else sees that and they go, well, that's not Ashtanga, I've waited in Kabatasa for like 5 years and he's doing that, and isn't there one truth that you do this and you stop, and then if you could
yeah.
do that, you do that, right? Like, so it all becomes like, well, to some people, unbelievable then, right?
Well, and
Because you can kind
and
of get around it, right?
that puts the responsibility on the teacher. And the teacher has to be willing to stand behind their advice and have the advice come from a very personal place, not only like in the advice they're offering to the student, but in a communication with the student about what is serving them and what is not. Because I feel like so much of progression in asana, it's about, what your body can physically do, but it's also about what you can handle in terms of how much energy you have to expend in your practice. It has to do with how much anguish in the mind comes from doing more or doing less, and learning how to confront that over time. So when we create these physical boundaries, there's such potential to be avoiding or overlooking the emotional and mental impact of progression through the practice. And I think oftentimes people don't persist with the practice, and they can't really articulate why. So they criticize the way the practice is approached physically, when really the problem is that their heart and their mind were not challenged and celebrated in the way it would need to be in order to be able to maintain a practice that requires such a level of dedication. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like a metaphor of a sweet jar. If you tell a kid, right, like, who hasn't, they're just playing, right, and then suddenly they've got the whole sweet jar possible, and then you go, well, you can't, here it is, but you can't have it, it's over there. Then all you can think about in the practice is getting to the sweet jar, right? The last posture, getting to it, right? Whereas actually, that's a complete distraction. You were quite happy playing with all the stuff that they got before, right? Some children can have this, but you can't yet. It all comes. The focus becomes on just that last little bit.
Yeah, getting
Forget
there,
the rest of it. Everything that was the before. I think that it's just kind of. I suppose I'd have the dialogue with a student about whether they want to stop or not. But if they want to go on, I'm always pleased to encourage them if it's safe, because I think that the blanket stopping then just becomes a negative kind of, they're not good enough. I really feel it enforces that sense of lack for them.
Yeah. I think you're right. For the average person, I think that's true. I don't want to say average, but for the normal householder, I absolutely think you're right that you don't want to foster a sense of competition, whether you're competing with yourself or the person on the mat next to you. You don't want to have this potential for a sense of success and failure around asana, because that's not sustainable long term. And just to play devil's advocate with it, though, I was stopped at Dvipada for 3 years, which a lot of people would say is is wrong. And not to say I personally actually stopped at Dvipada every day for 3 years. It was more that I just was aware that Dvipada was a weak point in my practice, and probably always will be. I don't know if I'll ever truly be comfortable in that posture, but there was a
You're
lot
not
of
alone there.
yeah.
Most people aren't.
There was a lot of value for me when I got past Vipada, and then Karnavasana was okay. I kind of enjoyed the challenge of that. There's not as much sense of failure when you fail. It's like, oh yeah, this is terrible. Like, you understand. Nakrasana was one that I also very much struggle with, and it was emotionally difficult to have to face it. But eventually I realized these stopping points are going to continue to present themselves, and you're never going to get to a point where you're like, hey, everything's great, I've got it, I can do everything. There's always, and that I think is the point of the series, that there's always going to be something that's going to challenge you and make you face this lack of success in your attempt, which is what we learn so much from in the practice. So I think, there's a very fine line between giving people these positive lessons of letting them try things and telling them that they're doing a great job, even if they're not making the desired shape, and teaching people to recognize that there's value in your experience, and there's success there, regardless of really whether it's that box checking success that we look at. But there's also a lot of value in recognizing, the first 2/3 of this posture are great and I'm doing a wonderful job, but the last third of the posture is not great and I'm not doing that correctly. And that's just information. It's neither good nor bad. It's not you're a good person because you can bind in Maricasana D, or you're a bad person because you can't. It's you either can bind or you can't bind. There's no value judgment to it. And I think being stopped and having your teacher, somebody who's supporting you emotionally, not somebody who's dictated you and telling you you're trash because you can't do the posture right. Because we know there are teachers who are like that, who like tell it imply to their students that they are less than. If they're not making these shapes, they're not, in the inner circle until they start intermediate or whatever. But if you're the type of teacher who uses like telling someone this is not correct and for your safety in the next few postures, we need to work on this until it's closer to correct. You have the opportunity to teach your students that it doesn't, like, it being correct or not correct is just a matter of like how you're moving your body. It has nothing to do with whether you're a good person or a bad person or worthy or unworthy. And that, that's what I'm talking about with like the emotional and mental work of the practice, that you need the teacher to present the practice and present these lessons appropriately. So often, especially these hyper traditional teachers are only using the asana and saying, stop there or do it one more time. And
I mean, I think that the teaching precedent has been set up, not to talk on about Mysore too much, but because of the logistics about time and space in Mysore, it's rather the brevity of instruction is equality there, right? Things are said, rather, succinctly, right? and without garnish, right? But we have more time and we're not, and also it's a different, outside that way of teaching in India, there's a different style of teaching, and I think, we don't react to people when we're getting a coffee in this way, right? Like, right, because that's not our cultural way of teaching. It's not so pedagogic, right? So I think, accordingly, everything it rests on how it's delivered, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly.
So you stop there or one, do this thing. It's not within our cultural context, and it sounds wrong and it strikes a discordant note, and, we don't, we haven't, over 100 years at least, had this kind of pedagogic style of teaching, which, which is, is the way that's currently still taught yoga in Mysore.
And I feel like it's very unfortunate that people come out of Mysore with a blessing to teach, and they are not confident in their own ability to communicate with students. So they imitate what they are comfortable with. Like, I was teaching with another teacher. I had been subbing for them while they were in Mysore. I did that for a number of teachers over a number of years. Would kind of travel around and take people's place. And so I was subbing for a teacher, and they got back, and I was explaining to them about the student who had sustained an injury outside of practice, and we were working with different techniques to kind of rehab it and make it work within the context of practice. And I was talking about the anatomical limitations of the injury. And the teacher told me that they didn't think it was appropriate for yoga teachers to speak from a point of anatomy because we're not doctors. And I was like, where are you coming from with how you teach asana if you're not speaking from anatomy? And it was this really tight-fisted holding on to the Mysore approach of you just tell them to do it again, you do a quick demonstration, you adjust them into it, and you move on.
But it's also to obscure. It's also to obscure information, right? I kind of see it as very similar to the church, right? It's like, well, we've got a Bible here, but it's in Latin, so you can't read it, right? Only I can understand it. But you will never teach you. We'll never give you a translation that you can understand, right? Because that would give you some autonomy in the whole process, and you might not need me.
Yeah, well, I think
But
that, but I
you
also
know,
think sometimes these teachers, they can make the shapes with their own body and they don't know what
well,
they're
they don't
doing.
know. Yeah, well,
And
that's as well. But
they don't know how to
yeah,
tell
yeah, yeah,
people
yeah,
what
yeah.
they're doing. They can show them and they can adjust them, but they can't actually articulate their experience because in all honesty, like these super advanced teachers, like sometimes it was just too easy for them to make those shapes. So they can't talk to somebody who can't do it because they don't have the experience of not being able to do it.
But that, I think that comes back to the emotional context. Now, I limited myself in the end after meeting Mark Darby, who basically kind of reiterated to me that I wasn't feeling anything in any of the shapes. I was doing an advanced series with him, and I was getting bored. I was getting bored, and I was making these shapes every day, and I just felt I was every day jumping over a kind of exotic obstacle course, really, of all these
Mhm.
funny little, but none of them meant anything. And I was just going to make one shape, then do the other thing, and then
Mhm.
and I didn't have any. There was no meat in it, there was no integral sense of something tangible in what I was
Mhm.
doing. Right, it was missing. And so I kind of feel that if you, my hope anyway, perhaps optimistically, is that in the end you give people an expansive view of it, and they will start to limit themselves as they understand the emotional interest in it. That it becomes
Mhm.
emotionally interesting, right?
Mhm.
So when you're talking about teachers who don't know what they, who can't teach it, I think they can't explain the emotional relevance of what it feels to be balanced in a posture as opposed
Yeah.
to make a shape, right? Like
Yeah.
when you're talking about emotions as well and postures being emotional, there's a sense of an ego battling with as to
Uh-huh.
what you'd like to be like and what reality is like. There's a bit of
Yeah.
that, right? And
Yeah.
it's not fair and other people can do this and why
Mm.
my stupid body can't do it, this kind of thing, a little bit, right? Like,
Yeah.
everyone has a bit
Oh,
of that, like, right, yeah,
more than a little
yeah,
for some of us.
yeah, yeah. But
Well,
also, there's a sense of, but like I feel mentally unstable, like to degrees, like not necessarily a basket case, but there's a sense of the mind being being fluctuating, right? And then there's a sense of coming to an asana at points, at times, and
mhm.
feeling a sense of sameness, a
Mhm.
samavritahi, there's the sense of equilibrium, right? And when you have that feeling, then it's like it's not correct because it's not the foot should be like that, not because my saw that you're told in my. It's because it feels okay. That feels right for the body. That feels
Mhm.
balanced, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great example of what I mean when I say like the actual physical expression of the pose is not as important as recognizing the like it's not good, it's not bad, it just this is just as it is. And sometimes like you get to that point of acknowledging within yourself, this is where I am with this pose. And maybe the pose is not technically correct, but that emotional awareness can sometimes be enough to like move forward a little bit and keep seeking that out because that previous pose is not 100% correct. I still need to look for that settling every day. That's an important pose that I shouldn't breeze past. But you know what I'm saying. Like that element of your existence in the pose. Maybe what is that sutra about asana being steady or something? Um, like when
Well,
you
I think
like.
there's an inner expression of it, and I think the inner expression can always be achieved by all people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's Janusha
Yeah,
Shasana
yeah,
and they sit and you can't come down at all, right? I see this, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you get the shape of Janusha Shasana, you can get the balance there with it,
yeah.
So it's always a fine balance, isn't it? From the technical expression being to the nth degree, or
Mhm.
finding the balance as it is for your own body, but
Mhm.
still there is an inherent need to challenge yourself still to be
So
to have some sense of
what's so
striving
interesting
forward.
about this is I feel like this the importance of what we're talking about right now is in the age of COVID and in the age of digital teaching, this is creating community in a way that there wasn't before. Because when the community was based on like physically going to Mysore and shalas with authorized teachers and the that very like physical parampara of like passing things down. I feel like with the changes in the last few years from having to shift more digitally, teachers who previously didn't have much of a platform, who are very good at communicating with students about this sort of thing, they're starting to have more room to communicate. And we're getting to, there's the Ashtanga Home Practitioners book group on Facebook, which, for better or for worse, it's a crazy place. But
yeah, I don't know. Right. Invite me.
Okay. It's wild.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin.
Sounds
it's
great.
a hell of a group.
Yeah.
But there's so many people in this group, and so many people who want to be like a part of a community, that I love that we're using the digital age as an opportunity to foster community and foster support for relationships to the practice that are not within that traditional framework, because it can serve so many more people that way. And sure, like, people are going to stray off the Ashtanga path, maybe without realizing it, and sometimes I imagine to their detriment, but it also will make so many more people able to use the tools of the Ashtanga method to serve them in the way that works for them. Because we need to accept as a community of practitioners, of, I'll lump myself in with teachers even though I'm not teaching, we need to accept that the traditional approach to Ashtanga does not serve most people.
Absolutely. I mean, that categorically so, but yeah. I mean, I think the dissemination of information is an amazing thing. And now we have a much more of a level playing field where really, you don't have to have your information drip fed to you from a few people, right? You can go online, and then, obviously this was creeping in beforehand, but it's much freer now, more open, right? With that, taking, you can take, and people do, right? They come to me and ask me for something, and they'll go to someone else, Mark Garreau, and ask him for something, right? And I think that's kind of very interesting. I mean, again, just to play devil's advocate with my own previous comments, that I reckon that there's still something to be said for an individual relationship with a teacher, which again goes back to the thing that I was actually kind of like shouting against earlier, the exclusivity idea that, the teacher, and the student have some kind of exclusive bind, and then, if the student was then on moon days or wherever else, to then go for a week to another teacher down the road, that would upset the original teacher, right? And then, which it does, and it's happened to me as well many times, probably on both sides of the fence.
Yeah.
But the longer I go on, as reticent as I am to say, I think that the yoga method, there's something that defines it about that personal relationship with a person.
Yeah. Well, and I think we benefit so much from having someone point things out to us. I think my Instagram was very popular because I would say very obvious things, and people would be like, whoa, and they resonate with it because it's something they already knew, but they feel empowered, they feel supported, they feel connected because I said it out loud. And I think that is something that, like, having a relationship with a teacher can do when you're having these experiences, these mental, emotional experiences via the asana practice, to have a teacher who is able to kind of say, this is what's happening. And for you to be able to be like, I knew that was what was happening, but I wasn't articulating it to myself. And to have someone kind of guide you and hold your hand and kind of help steer you through that process is so invaluable. Whether they're, dialoguing with you about your experience the way, you and I like to do as teachers, or whether they're the type of teacher who will say, I think we should work on this pose for a little bit longer, let's give it a couple weeks. Or a teacher who will say, no, I think you're ready for the next one, go ahead and try it, even when the student doesn't want to or doesn't think they're ready to.
So do you think it waters it down and undercuts it when you have 5 people dialoguing about one student's progression, right? Because now they're online, say, with the dissemination of information, it's a wonderful thing, but now they're online, coming to see me, come to see 5 other teachers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
and there's something, and I hate to say it, but I think there's something that's slightly lost about that relationship, which
I I agree. I think there's certainly avoidance. I know in the town where I live, there were the last time I was teaching, there were 2 other authorized teachers in town, and so it was kind of a joke that the teachers would like circulate that or the students would circulate. I was the very like cerebral, very chatty, like what are you trying to get out of your practice? We need that as a baseline to progress teacher. And then there was like the really nice teacher who would kind of let you do whatever you wanted, and they would like help you with stuff that was fun. And then there was like the harsh teacher who was like super traditional and like students would leave crying kind of situation. And I would joke that like people would go to the harsh teacher because they wanted to be pushed. They wanted
and people,
to be,
and there were a lot of people want that. Yeah,
yeah, they wanted the exclusivity. They wanted to be in the club, and they
rules
would
and
get,
strictness, and
yep, and they would get hurt. They would get physically hurt. They would get mentally or emotionally hurt, and they would come to me. And I would like rehab their emotional relationship to the practice and get them to the point where they felt like they didn't need to quit. They just needed to change their approach. And then they would move on from me because they're like, shut up, I just want to do my practice. And they would go to the nice teacher, and the nice teacher would let them have fun and would let them do handstands, and they would give them all the adjustments they wanted and none of the adjustments they didn't want. And they'd have a great time, and then they'd be like, I'm ready to throw down, and they go back to the mean teacher. And it was this like
that actually
cycle.
happened.
Yes.
Oh my
Yes.
God, that's so
Many
funny.
times. It was crazy. And it was so transparent what was happening.
But
And
it's an interesting kind of archetype, isn't it? Through all different
yeah,
approaches to practice, right? Like,
right. And I think it was a good lesson to me in that like I didn't want to be either of those other teachers. You know, even though I had like working relationships, like good relationships, like they weren't, it wasn't the kind of space I wanted to teach in. So I had my own space. But it was a good lesson in like the way I wanted to teach was not necessarily better, because it had its place and it was useful during periods of struggle in the practice. But the way I wanted to teach wasn't really sustainable day to day for most students. They needed to just like show up and do their work. And I'm like, so what do you think it means? You know?
people don't want that before work necessarily.
No, they don't.
Is it? But you weren't supported by the other teachers. You said you had a working relationship, but you weren't really in dialogue with them, or you know. Is it possible? I wonder.
One of them I was.
Right. Okay.
One of them I was, and the other.
Is it an ideal that we could all be friends as teachers, or is the spirit of capitalism just cut that possibility off at the root?
That's really, really hard, because
if money was out of the equation, it would be a different story, wouldn't it? Right?
Yeah, but so I've taught in a community where money was out of the equation because it was a privately funded program, so it was either free or very, very cheap for students, and there's still the competition of like who has more students in their class, and whose students are the most advanced students, and whose students come most frequently. So to me, it's more like whose students keep practicing for the longest. You know, like if you have the biggest class of short-term students who burn out after 6 or 8 months, like what does that really say about your community? So
unfortunately, there just seems to be an unending pool of these students who kind of come through. So what I find is that those popular teachers who go for the short-term gains, they're never really shown up, because there seems to be a kind of an unending pool of uninjured newbies to kind of cycle through. I guess I guess there's still, our birth rates aren't that low yet. That like people are coming, people come, when they come at 18 or whatever, 20, they go to uni. I'll do a bit of yoga now. They go to the class, right? Fill up these big classes, right? Everyone doing handstands and all these things, crazy things out of their ability. They get injured. The integral teacher down the road is trying to sustain students, but they don't always look so popular because they're going for the long-term gains, right?
Yeah, and sustainability in a yoga practice is so important, but it's not prioritized by teachers. In my experience, I find
or students.
Teachers,
or students, because
Well,
you don't go.
sure,
You
but
could
I
go.
don't
You
think the
thank me. You
students.
could go. You thank me in 5 years, but it doesn't. It's like, well, who
Yeah,
cares? I'm having fun
I
now.
don't,
I mean,
I don't think the students can be blamed for that. They
no.
don't know
That's
any
that's
better.
what I mean. You don't know. You just think,
Yeah,
well, I'm having fun now. Like I feel
yeah,
fine. I mean, I had the
yeah,
same thing. It's like my shoulders feel fine doing this. Right? It's like
yeah,
10 years down the road. Well, I wish someone had told me that then. But I wouldn't have
yeah,
listened anyway.
yeah, yeah. Or somebody did tell me that, and I did not
Yeah, probably they did.
listen. Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah.
don't know.
It's too bad that we can't. That it's so hard to have multiple teachers in one Mysore room. Not to say it can't be done, because I've seen it, and I've done it reasonably successfully. Taught in a room with another teacher. Like, I had a teacher that would teach for a couple hours, and then I would teach for a couple hours, so we had a lot of overlapping students, and that was really beneficial for me because I didn't want to badmouth them to our students. Like, I liked them very much. I thought they were very dedicated. I thought they were a responsible teacher. So when it was my turn to teach, if their students were overlapping, that's kind of where I got my instinct to say, like, what are you doing and why are you doing it? Is it serving you? Is it because this person told you to? If they told you to, like, I respect them. It's probably worthwhile advice. Let's consider why. Now, here's what I might do differently, and you got to choose for yourself what you're going to do with that information. But as a student, like, we talked about this, it was a very slow process. When you have lots of people, different people, even if they're different people you respect very much and are willing to completely surrender to in the moment, like, I will do whatever you tell me to do. When you have, like, 2 or 3 different people you're doing that with throughout the course of a year, the progress is slow because they're going to conflict. And you're not going to know what to do. It's much, much easier.
It's confusing, and I think what people want, certainly the beginning of for many, many years, I think, of what we all want is definite ways of doing things that, I mean, just someone come in and go, well, you could do it that way, but maybe it's not right, and really you're going to, maybe you should find your own way because your own body probably knows best, right? That's not really the message that you want to hear. Like, for many years you just want to hear, like, the teacher saying to you, well, that's the way to do it, right? And just do it like that. It's like, okay, fine. Don't have to think. For one time of the day, I don't have to think. Great.
Yeah. And that's kind of the line that I think we've been kind of stepping on either side of it in this conversation, is like there's a season, when you start practicing, it's so much more beneficial to have a single source of information, to be very consistent, to stick to the structure, and to just give a few years for everything to settle. Let your body adjust to it. Go slowly. Take your time to let your mind adjust to the sense of competition within yourself, that the desire to rush forward and have your ego fulfilled through creating shapes and being given permission. But then there also comes a point where you have to tip it to the other side, where you have to start saying, okay, where should these rules be adjusted to accommodate me personally, where it might be beneficial to go to someone other than your teacher, so you could see how much of the structure of my practice is based on me and how much of it is based on my teacher's preferences. Because as teachers, we can't help but want to use the same tools on our students that worked on ourselves, and sometimes that doesn't
they do it the way you
them.
want. You say, well done, that's good. I hear myself saying the same thing. Oh, I like that shape according to what I believe that shape should. Oh, well done.
Right.
And then I think, well,
exactly.
you know what, like, that's just my preference for looking at it in that way. But I was kind of thinking when I was talking, I interviewed Stephen Porges a while back, right, on the podcast. Who he's the polyvagal theory guy, and he talks a lot about co-regulation and giving certain signals that are outside verbal communication. So he talks a lot about intonation of voice and facial recognition in terms of expression, right? And I think a lot more of this kind of thing needs to be expanded into the realm and the structure of the Mysore room, which is currently still treated as some kind of rudimentary kind of obscure gymnastics, right? Where it really is interpersonal relationships. The framework is obviously asana, but really, I mean, most of what's being learned is how to relate to one another, right? albeit that, a lot of it's done in silence and a lot of it's done just with a teacher. But also the students should also have some framework to relate to each other as well.
Well, I think that's why home practice can be so hard. When you're in a Mysore room and you have other people around you doing their practices, even if you are, pretty mentally disciplined and you don't particularly observe the other people and what they're doing, it still has a very strong impact on your own focus. Whereas if you're at home and you're trying to do your practice and there's no one around you, and there's no kind of external expectation for behavior, it can be much harder to maintain the same focus, to maintain the same level of effort and stamina around it. And it's not because of anything directly that's happening. It's just that sort of subconscious community experience. I think that's why so many people have really been thriving with Zoom Mysore classes, and not because they're like getting a whole lot of useful feedback, and not because they're watching their cohorts. Half the time I hear they don't even turn their cameras on, so they're just doing their practice.
Really?
With that
That's
kind
crazy.
of sound
Right.
and
Because
that.
I run one, but I've never. Right. I do think the more I go on, the lot of it is just that they like hearing each other's names. They say that they're hearing the same names every day makes a difference. They feel like there's something it's like having the radio on in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and
It's
I
kind
think
of comforting. You feel connected to one another.
we want to be part of a community, and I think that's why people want to go to Mysore, because that's a community. And once you have set foot in the shala, you are part of it, and no one can take that away. Like, regardless of whether you get stopped at Marichasana D or you go all the way through second series, you've been there and you are part of it, and no one can take that away from you. And I think that is really important to us, to feel like we're part of it. Like, when I'm not authorized anymore. Like, I didn't send in my information to get switched over to Sharat's list because I don't.
Somehow I got switched over. I don't know what went wrong there.
How fancy.
I know.
And it was hard for me because I had to, I didn't do it because it was just very inconvenient at that time in my life and what I was personally dealing with. I didn't have time to find my stupid form and send a picture. I was kind of petty about how much money did I spend? Just switch my name over. But on the flip side, it was cathartic for me to decide that I don't need to be on a list on the internet to consider myself a part of a community. I don't need that. If people want to work on their practice with me and they care whether or not my name is on that list, then they don't know me. And maybe they need to get to know me a little bit. And I feel like I've made myself available on the internet to get to know me a little better than my name being on a list has. So, but that.
Do you still feel you're part of a community? Now you're not teaching and you're not kind of out there. Do you still feel that you're part of something on a personal level?
I feel I have a relationship to my practice that I feel like makes me a part of the community. I don't have to engage with the community to be a part of it, because there is the practice connects us. And I could talk to anyone who is part of the Ashtanga community and find a connection with them, whether I've maintained a connection to the community or not. Does that make sense? I recently met a neighbor of mine who has a son.
It's quite kind of complicated.
Yeah.
Kind of getting to the kind of post-structural theory kind of.
Yeah. A neighbor of mine who I quite like, her son is around my son's age, and they were playing, and we were chatting one day, and she asked what I used to do, and I told her I used to teach yoga, and we were chatting about it, and then it came out that she had practiced Ashtanga, and she had practiced at a pretty successful, well-known Ashtanga studio where I had known some of the teachers there, and And it just, I was very casually like, oh yeah, I used to go to Mysore, and it took her a few minutes to realize I meant Karnataka, not like the Mysore studio
Right.
across town. And I was like, I love my joke line is to be like, oh, I'm level 2 authorized. I used to do this and that, because it's like, because you don't, people who practice in communities and don't think about going to Mysore see it as this like very a separate kind of community. And we chatted about our experiences of practice and how our practice has changed since having kids, and how we used to look at it versus how we look at it now. And we had this totally connected, engaged conversation about our practice where we truly understood each other. And we had never talked about it before. Like, she had only ever practiced in a shala that doesn't have authorized teachers, is like kind of against that as a paradigm. And like, I have really only ever worked like through the traditional system and worked with certified teachers and worked with Sharat. And like, we should have been at opposite ends of the community spectrum of dialogue, but we connected over maintaining practice as mothers of young children. And I feel like, that's where community is for me. Like, where does your experience of your practice connect with this other person's experience of their practice? And then you are community, whether you love being stopped at poses versus want to just do all the crazy shit at the end of third. Like, if you both struggled to learn to stand up and drop back, then you can talk about that, and you are community in that, whether it's a physical experience that you both had or an emotional experience that you both had, like, that's where community is. And I feel like that's where we need to be seeking each other out, rather than saying, you're not my community because you have a different physical experience. You're not my community because you have a different way to progress. We should be embracing, like, we are community because we share these threads that connect us in all these different ways, that it helps us to know we're not alone. Like, we need to know we're not alone, whether we're getting on our Zoom with our camera off and we're just hearing the breath in the background. Knowing we're not alone helps us keep doing the work.
Yeah, it's incredibly supportive, isn't it?
Worth doing. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I couldn't say it better than that, so I think we'll leave it there. Fantastic roundup. You said it so well.
Yeah, we really came full circle. We brought it back to community.
No, which is what we wanted, and that message is very much my own, to my own heart. You hear all this. I mean, especially when Peg, I think, was talking on a conference I did about women mothers being criticised because they couldn't practice every day by authorised teachers. Well, you can't, you're not showing up, so therefore you're not a dedicated student, and you're lazy or something. It's just like, oh my god, this is actually going on. This is insane.
Yeah.
I mean, what you want is, anyone to get on the mat for 5-10 minutes and consider themselves connected to something, something more than just material life. It doesn't have to be anything that's spelt out, just something other.
Yeah, and that's kind of what, like, my Instagram started as just like I was making jokes to my friends that I missed, because I missed that sense of community when I had stepped back. And so it just started as making jokes, and more people started tagging along with the jokes. And I realized that what we really needed was a conversation with like an overlay of humor, but we needed a conversation that helped people feel connected, that made people feel like there are other people who are having the same experience of the community and of the practice as me. And that's what we should be doing, like, as teachers or as like leaders of a community. Like, we should be fostering that connection rather
get back on the Instagram then.
Oh, I know, it takes so much time. It takes so much time,
and it's so good. It's so good. You've got to get. You just said it. You just said it. You've got to get back on it. It's needed.
I do, right? And I love it. I miss it.
I miss you as well.
Oh, thank you. I'm
not so funny as you are.
I fully intended to come back this year and just.
Yeah, you've got to come back. Yeah.
Okay.
Hold you to it then. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for your time, and
Yeah.
I think it was a really, really nice conversation. So thanks,
Yeah.
Zoe, and
Nice to
hope
see you.
everyone enjoyed it. Let us know in the comments. Right? Bye for now.